The dust of the Nevada desert settled on everything with the patient indifference of time itself. It coated the sterile white buildings of the high-security flight test facility, the rows of humming generators, and the crisp uniform of the woman who had just stepped out of the transport vehicle. Her name, according to the flimsy file Colonel Madsen held, was Anya Volkov. The file listed her as a civilian consultant, a systems analyst sent from a bureaucratic branch of the Department of Defense so obscure it felt like a clerical error. She stood without fidgeting, her posture straight but not military, her gaze fixed on the heat haze shimmering above the distant runway. She looked unremarkable. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, severe knot. Her face was clean of makeup, its lines suggesting an age somewhere between 35 and 45, a decade of ambiguity etched by something other than years. The two young airmen assigned to escort her exchanged a look of profound boredom. Another desk jockey from Washington, sent to justify a budget or write a useless report. They saw her plain, functional clothing and her quiet demeanor and wrote her off in a single, shared glance. Useless. Colonel Richard Madsen watched her approach from the window of his second-story office. He was a man carved from the rigid bedrock of military tradition, a third-generation aviator whose world was composed of thrust-to-weight ratios, operational readiness, and the clear, unyielding lines of authority. Anya Volkov was a smudge on his clean schematic. He had argued against her assignment. "We don't need another analyst, Command," he barked into the secure phone line. "We need pilots. We need engineers. We don't need a paper pusher to tell us how to fly the birds we built." The response from the four-star general on the other end had been unnervingly calm. "She is not a request, Colonel. She is a resource. Use her." Madsen had hung up, the word resource tasting like ash in his mouth. Now, seeing her in the flesh, he felt his irritation harden into a cold certainty. She was a ghost, a nonentity sent to haunt his base. He strode out of his office, his boots striking the polished linoleum with sharp, impatient clicks. He met her in the main corridor, the airmen flanking her like reluctant bookends. He did not offer his hand. "Ms. Volkov," he said, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. "I am Colonel Madsen. I'll be frank. I don't know why you're here. My people are the best in the world at what they do. We are running final trials on the Kestrel VTOL program. It is a delicate, high-stakes operation. We don't have time for administrative oversight." His dismissal was a physical force, designed to put her on the back foot. Anya simply met his gaze. Her eyes were a deep, steady gray, and for a fleeting moment, Madsen felt an odd sensation, as if he were the one being assessed. "I'm here to observe, Colonel," she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying no hint of protest or defensiveness. It was a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the concrete walls around them. "I'll stay out of your way," Madsen grunted, a sound of profound skepticism. "See that you do," he snapped, turning on his heel. "Sharp," he called out to a young, cocky lieutenant swaggering down the hall. "Show Ms. Volkov the simulator deck." "Let her." Observe. Lieutenant Sharp, a pilot with more confidence than flight hours, gave Anya a lazy, dismissive once-over. "This way, ma'am," he said, the word "ma'am" dripping with condescension. "Try not to touch anything." Anya followed him without a word, her silence a stark contrast to Sharp's constant, self-important chatter. She walked through the hangars, past the gleaming, predatory shapes of the Kestrels. They were engineering marvels, vertical takeoff and landing craft that were more beast than machine. They were notoriously difficult to fly, demanding a fusion of pilot and computer that few could master. While Sharp boasted about the Kestrel's performance metrics, Anya's attention was elsewhere. She watched the ground crews. She saw the quiet competence of a grizzled Master Sergeant, Evans, as he checked the hydraulic lines on a landing strut, his movements economical and certain. She saw the subtle tension in the shoulders of the junior mechanics, the fear of making a mistake on a multi-billion-dollar piece of hardware. Her gaze lingered on one of the Kestrels parked in a diagnostic bay. Its canopy was open like a waiting maw. She felt a low hum in her bones, a resonance she hadn't felt in years. It was the phantom call of a machine that understood her, and one she understood in return. Sharp, noticing her distraction, smirked. Impressive, right? Not something you can appreciate by looking at a spreadsheet. Anya didn't respond. Her eyes traced the complex network of wiring beneath an open maintenance panel. She saw a diagnostic port that the schematics on a nearby monitor didn't show. An old modification. A ghost in the machine. As she shifted her weight, the cuff of her long-sleeved shirt rode up her wrist for a moment. Sergeant Evans, looking up from his work, caught a glimpse of dark ink against her skin before she casually pulled the sleeve back down. It was a fleeting image, intricate and strange, but it snagged in his memory. It looked like a serpent of some kind, coiled around something he couldn't make out. He frowned, a flicker of something other than indifference in his expression. In the simulator deck, the atmosphere was thick with professional arrogance. The pilots here were the elite, the chosen few destined to tame the Kestrel. Sharp was showing off, running a combat scenario in one of the high-fidelity simulators. "Watch this," he crowed to the other pilots gathered around. On the massive screen, the simulated Kestrel executed a gut-wrenching maneuver, dodging enemy fire in a narrow canyon. Anya stood at the back of the room, near a secondary control console, her presence already forgotten. She wasn't watching the screen. She was watching the data streams on a small, auxiliary monitor, her eyes tracking the flow of information between the pilot's controls and the simulator's core programming. She saw the tiny, almost imperceptible lag. She saw the micro-corrections the system was making, compensating for the pilot's aggressive inputs. She saw the strain. The strain became a fracture. Sharp, pushing the simulation to its breaking point, yanked the stick hard left to evade a phantom missile. On the main screen, the Kestrel stuttered. The image flickered, then dissolved into a waterfall of green, corrupted code. Alarms blared, a cacophony of digital screams. "What the hell?" Sharp yelled, his hands useless on the dead controls. "System crash. Full core failure." The two instructors rushed to the main console, their faces tight with alarm. "I can't get it to respond," one said, his voice rising in panic. "The reboot command isn't working." "It's a hard lock." Colonel Madsen stormed into the room, his face a thundercloud. "What is going on?" "Core logic failure, sir," an instructor reported, sweat beading on his forehead. Sharp pushed it too hard, and the system cascaded. "We can't even get into the root directory to force a reset. We'll have to call in the techs from corporate. It could be down for days." In the middle of final trials, days was a death sentence. Madsen's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He was about to unleash a torrent of fury when he noticed the movement at the back of the room. It was the woman. The consultant. Anya Volkov. She was moving toward the secondary console, the one no one ever used. She moved with a quiet, fluid efficiency that was utterly at odds with the frantic energy in the room. She did not ask for permission. She did not offer an explanation. Her fingers settled on the keyboard, and she began to type. There was no hesitation. Her hands moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing, a blur of motion that spoke of thousands of hours of muscle memory. A black command window opened on the small screen, a river of white text scrolling upwards at an impossible rate. It wasn't the standard interface. It was a direct line into the machine's soul, a language the system's own designers had forgotten. "What does she think she's doing?" Sharp scoffed, but his voice was thin, uncertain. The instructors stared, mouths agape. They were watching a surgeon perform an operation they didn't have the language to describe. Anya's face was a mask of pure concentration. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, but it was clear she was seeing something beyond the code. She was seeing the architecture, the pathways, the flawed logic coiling in on itself. She found it, a recursive error in the fail-safe protocols, a tiny, elegant piece of code that, under extreme stress, had begun to eat itself. With a final, swift series of keystrokes, she severed the loop, isolated the corrupted files, and forced a hard reboot from a pre-failure system image that wasn't supposed to be accessible. The blaring alarms cut off, plunging the room into a ringing silence. On the main screen, the waterfall of green code vanished. The Kestrel's cockpit view reappeared, pristine and stable, hovering in a clear blue sky. The system was back online. Perfectly stable. Anya stepped back from the console, her work done. She flexed her fingers once, then let her hands fall to her sides. The silence in the room was thick with astonishment. Every eye was on Anya. The pilots, the instructors, and Colonel Madsen stared at the quiet woman who had just done the impossible. It was Madsen who broke the silence, his voice low and laced with a new, unfamiliar tone. It wasn't respect, not yet, but the sharp edge of his dismissiveness had been blunted. "How did you do that?" he asked, walking slowly toward her. Anya met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "The fail-safe protocols had a recursive loop," she said, her voice calm and level. Under maximum stress, the error correction was creating more errors than it could solve. It needed to be interrupted at the root level. Her explanation was technically accurate but explained nothing. It didn't explain how she knew about a flaw buried so deep in the code that the system's own builders would need a week to find it. It didn't explain how she had access to command prompts that were supposed to be locked. As she spoke, she unconsciously pushed her sleeve up slightly to cool her wrist. This time, Sergeant Evans, who had been drawn in by the commotion, got a clear look at the tattoo. A black viper, its scales rendered in painstaking detail, was coiled tightly around a small, stylized bell that had no clapper. A silent bell. The image struck him like a physical blow. A ghost of a memory surfaced, a story he'd heard a decade ago from a special forces operator in a dusty bar in Afghanistan. A story about a phantom unit, a black ops team that flew missions nobody else could. They were called Project Chimera. They didn't officially exist. And their lead pilot, a legend spoken of only in whispers, had a call sign that matched that impossible ink. But that was just a story. A myth. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted. Whispers began to ripple through the room. "Who is she?" Sharp muttered to another pilot, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a confused awe. Madsen's eyes narrowed, studying Anya not as a bureaucrat, but as a puzzle. "That, root level, is classified access only, Ms. Volkov," he said, testing her. "Your file says you're a systems analyst." "The file is correct," Anya replied, her gaze unwavering. She offered no more. She didn't need to. The evidence of her skill was humming quietly from the restored simulator. The perception of her had begun to shift. She was no longer a useless paper pusher. She was an enigma, and in a world built on absolutes, enigmas were both dangerous and valuable. The next day, the enigma was put to a new test. A high-altitude reconnaissance drone, one of the new stealth models, had gone down deep inside a neighboring country's heavily fortified and electronically saturated border zone. It wasn't an act of aggression, just a catastrophic systems failure, but the drone carried sensitive imaging technology that could not be allowed to fall into their hands. The area was a hornet's nest of overlapping radar systems and signal jammers. Sending in a conventional rescue team was suicide. A satellite strike would destroy the evidence, but also confirm the drone's presence, creating a diplomatic nightmare. They were out of options. In the Tactical Operations Center, the mood was grim. The screen showed a map saturated with red threat circles. "There's no way in," Madsen said, his voice tight. "Their electronic warfare suite is top tier. Our birds would be blind and deaf before they even crossed the border. We can't guide anything in remotely." He ran a hand over his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Then, his gaze drifted across the room and landed on Anya. She was standing quietly in the corner, observing the screens, just as she had said she would. But her observation was different now. It was active, analytical. He could almost see the calculations running behind her steady gray eyes. An idea, born of desperation and a burgeoning, grudging respect, began to form in his mind. The Kestrel. It was designed for low-level, nap-of-the-earth flight. Its unique engine signature could, in theory, be masked by canyons and ground clutter. But it would require a pilot who could fly it blind, navigating by instinct, landmarks, and the feel of the machine alone. A pilot who didn't need the crutch of modern electronics. Every pilot on his base, even the cocky Lieutenant Sharp, was a product of the digital age. They were brilliant, but they were tethered to their systems. He walked over to Anya, his footsteps the only sound in the silent room. The entire command staff watched him. "The Kestrel," he said, his voice low, not a command but a question. It could theoretically make the run if it stayed below their radar floor. But the pilot would have no navigation, no comms, no targeting computer. He paused, studying her face. It would have to be flown purely by hand. By feel, he was laying out an impossible task, a suicide mission. He was expecting her to demur, to state the obvious risks, to confirm that she was, after all, just an analyst. Anya looked from the map to Madsen, her expression unchanging. She gave a single, slow nod. "Yes," she said. The one word hung in the air, heavier than any speech. It was not a boast. It was an affirmation. A statement of capability. Madsen stared at her for a long moment, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. The simulator. The impossible code. The unnatural calm. He was looking at something he thought had been relegated to legend. "Get her a flight suit," he ordered, his voice ringing with a new, absolute authority. The hangar bay was silent save for the hum of the Kestrel's auxiliary power unit. The ground crew, led by Sergeant Evans, moved with a solemn efficiency as they prepped the aircraft. They watched Anya as she performed her pre-flight check. She didn't use the digital tablet checklist like the other pilots. She moved around the Kestrel with an intimate familiarity, her hands running over its composite skin, her ears cocked to the specific pitch of its systems coming online. She tapped a panel near the starboard engine, listening to the vibration. "The gyro stabilizer in the primary vector nozzle is off by 0.02 degrees, she said to Evans, her voice quiet but clear over the ambient noise. "It will cause a slight yaw instability during vertical descent." Evans stared at her, then at his own diagnostic monitor. He ran a deep-level check. After a moment, his eyes widened. She was right. It was a discrepancy so minor it was within official tolerances, something no other pilot would have ever noticed until it was too late. He made the adjustment, his hands suddenly feeling clumsy under her watchful gaze. In the suiting-up room, Anya pulled on the G-suit and helmet. As she raised her arms to fasten the chest harness, her sleeve slid all the way up her forearm, fully revealing the tattoo. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, it was stark and clear, a coiled black viper, its fangs bared, encircling a bell with no clapper. The silent bell of Echo. The deadly strike of the viper. In the operations center, Madsen was watching the hangar feed on the main screen. He zoomed in on her wrist. The image of the tattoo filled the screen. All the air went out of his lungs. Project Chimera. A program so secret it had been erased from most official records. It had been an experimental unit of pilots and operators tasked with impossible missions, using technology that was decades ahead of its time. They were ghosts. Phantoms. Their identities were buried under layers of black ink and classified firewalls. And their leader, the one who could fly any machine as if it were an extension of her own body, the one who wrote half the flight control code for the Kestrel's predecessor herself, was a legend known only by her call sign. A pilot presumed killed in action during a mission over the Barents Sea nearly a decade ago. Madsen's face went pale. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a waxy, shocked mask. He turned to his aide, his voice a choked whisper that was nonetheless picked up by the room's sensitive microphones. Get me the Chimera file. The Tier 0 classified file, he swallowed hard. I need the entry for Echo Viper 13, he turned back to the screen, his gaze fixed on the woman climbing into the cockpit of his most advanced aircraft. He was not looking at a systems analyst. He was looking at a ghost. A legend made flesh. And he had just asked her to fly into hell. The Kestrel lifted off the tarmac not with the roar of a jet, but with the controlled, whispering hiss of its vertical thrusters. It rose 50 feet, hovered for a beat as solid as a granite monument, then tilted forward and vanished into the pre-dawn darkness. There was no sonic boom, just a ripple in the air and then, silence. Inside the cockpit, Anya was completely in her element. The world of digital noise and electronic chatter had fallen away. There was only the deep, resonant hum of the engines, the feel of the air over the control surfaces, and the dim glow of the analog backup gauges. She flew low, a phantom skimming the desert floor, her mind a living map of the terrain ahead. She navigated by the stars and the subtle contours of the earth, skills learned in a forgotten school of aviation. In the operations center, they could only watch a single, blinking dot on a map that represented her last known position before she went dark. The room was tense, the silence broken only by the quiet hum of the servers. Lieutenant Sharp stood transfixed, all his youthful arrogance stripped away, replaced by a profound understanding of his own limitations. He was watching a master at work, a pilot from another era, another level of existence. Colonel Madsen stood like a statue, his eyes glued to the screen, his mind replaying the name. Echo Viper 13. A pilot who had single-handedly disabled an entire enemy fleet's communication array using a prototype electronic warfare package. A pilot who had landed a crippled aircraft on a postage stamp carrier deck in a typhoon. A pilot who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Hours crawled by. The sun began to stain the eastern horizon with shades of orange and pink. Then, a single, clear blip appeared on the screen, exactly where it was supposed to be, back on their side of the border. "She's back," an operator breathed, the relief in his voice palpable. A few moments later, the Kestrel appeared, a dark shape against the rising sun. It approached the base not with the swagger of a victor, but with the quiet purpose of a tool being returned to its place. It settled onto the landing pad with a whisper-soft touchdown, its movements as precise and gentle as Anya's work on the simulator keyboard. The mission was a success. The canopy hissed open. Anya, looking tired but composed, disembarked. As her boots hit the tarmac, she saw that the entire command staff and all the base's pilots were waiting for her. They weren't cheering. They weren't speaking. They were standing in a silent, respectful formation. As she walked toward them, Colonel Madsen stepped forward. He didn't offer a handshake or a word of thanks. He simply came to attention, his back ramrod straight, and rendered a slow, perfect salute. It was the highest honor one warrior could give another. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was reverence. Instantly, Sharp, then every other pilot on the tarmac, followed his lead. A silent, uniformed forest of salutes, offered to the quiet woman in the borrowed flight suit. Anya stopped. She looked at Madsen, then her gaze swept over the faces of the young pilots, seeing the awe that had replaced their scorn. She held their gaze for a long, silent moment. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the recognition she needed. It was all she would ever accept. Her work was done. The next morning, the same nondescript transport vehicle that had brought her arrived to take her away. She had no bags to pack. She had arrived with nothing and she was leaving with nothing, save for the quiet, unspoken respect of an entire military base. As she walked toward the vehicle, she paused and looked back at the main hangar. The massive doors were open, and she could see the Kestrel she had flown, gleaming under the lights. Sergeant Evans was there, polishing a panel on its nose cone. He saw her looking and stopped his work. He didn't salute. He did something more personal. He tapped his fist over his heart twice, a silent, soldier-to-soldier gesture of profound respect and gratitude. A shared secret between two professionals who understood the soul of a machine. Anya met his gaze and gave him that same, small nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned, climbed into the vehicle, and was gone. Colonel Madsen watched from his office window as the transport drove away, kicking up a plume of desert dust that hung in the still air like a ghost. He looked down at the file on his desk. It was the original, Tier 0 file for Echo Viper 13. Most of it was still blacked out, but the final entry was now updated. Mission status, active. Assignment, Consultant, Nevada Test Range. Objective, complete. He closed the file. The woman they had called useless was gone, back to the shadows from whence she came. But she had left something behind. In the hushed hangars, the young pilots now spoke of flying not just with skill, but with feel. In the operations center, the instructors were rewriting their curriculum, adding sections on manual navigation and instinctual flying. A transformation had occurred, quiet and profound. The final image that lingered in Madsen's mind was not of the salutes or the successful mission, but of her hand on the Kestrel's fuselage, a silent communion between a master and her craft. The machine was quiet now, waiting. The dust settled. And the legend of Echo Viper 13 returned to the silence, her strength honored, her story unexplained, her presence a permanent echo on the winds of the desert.